Welcome back to Outdoor Fitness Junkie. Today we're going to talk about how I plan my own backpacking trips. Every trip is going to have a particular goal. It's either going to be a time-based trip or it's going to be a location-based trip. Time-based are kind of like spring break, or you have a long weekend coming up in a couple months. Whereas like a location-based is going to be based on like a certain location that you want to go to, such as a national park, a certain trail that you want to do, like the Appalachian Trail, or just a certain landmark that you want to get to. For instance, going to a peak or a waterfall, or just something in particular that you really want to get to. Once you kind of figure that out, then you can work the ladder of whichever one you choose. If you have a time-based goal, you figure out the location that works, or if you have a location, you figure out the time that works. While you're considering the location or time, whichever one that is the ladder, you do have to keep in mind a couple things. First thing are the logistics. How are you going to get there? Is it going to be as easy as jumping into the car and just driving a couple hours? Or do you need to plan flights or a cross-country road trip? Permits and gear requirements are something that you also want to look out for. For instance, permits can range from walking into a ranger station and just signing a piece of paper and you're good to go, to a lottery system where you may or may not get a permit for that year. Gear requirements are another thing to keep in mind. Some areas are going to have you store your food a certain way, whether that be a bear bag, bear can, or have bear boxes and you just need to follow the rules. Other areas are going to have you dispose of your waste in a certain way. Things like that you just kind of want to research to make sure that you are comfortable with those requirements. And if you're not, find a different place to go hike. Solo backpacking is amazing and I highly recommend once you get comfortable with the process. However, if it's your first backpacking trip, I would highly recommend that you bring a friend, especially one that's experienced, or at least somebody there just for safety precautions. Plus, on top of that, I would stay close in your local area just because you'll know the area, and if you do need to get out of a bad situation, you're close to home. Mileage and elevation gain is going to be another thing you want to consider when it comes to picking out the actual trail that you're going to do, or what time you're going to do a certain trail. For instance, the Appalachian Trail is going to take about 4 to 6 months, maybe 7, depending on how fast you hike, or any other complications that go throughout your entire trip. When you're trying to plan a quick trip for spring break or a long weekend, this is something you want to keep in mind. About 5 to 10 miles per day is typically what I like to tell beginners, especially if it's your very first backpacking trip. You're not trying to go as fast as possible or get as many miles as you can. It's your first trip. Make it enjoyable. Don't make it so miserable that you hate it and you never do it again.
I have been up for 2 days with very little sleep, and I just got to sleep for I think about 4 more hours.
Now let's look into weather. So if, for instance, you're going to do a hiking backpacking trip in the winter time, probably not the greatest time in the world, depending on where you're at. So if you're in Florida, that is like the prime time to go off and backpack. It's going to be flat trails, it's going to be nice and cool, but not too hot where you're hating life. Whereas if you were up in, like, for instance, Minnesota or in Colorado and you were not prepared for any of those conditions, you're not going to have a great time, and it can also be a safety concern. So keep in mind the climate of when you are hiking.
I needed this so much.
Now that you know the when and where for your trip, it's time to make a brief plan. Any intricate schedule that I've ever made for outdoor trips goes out the window the moment you step on trail. You can do this with maps, guidebooks, websites, and other forums to get an understanding of what you're going to get yourself into. How many campsites are available? Do you have to be at a certain campsite because of a permit? What are the good water sources that are on trail? Plant and animal and bug encounters are good to know as well if you need bug spray or bear spray. Type of campsites are good to know as well, because if you're going to bring a hammock, it's good to know if you're going to have trees or not. You also want to know what other trails are nearby, any roads or towns, just in case for planning purposes, or if you get lost, you kind of have an understanding where everything is. The other thing that I would advise is calling up a ranger and seeing if you are allowed to have a fire, how good the water sources are, and just in general the trail conditions. The next thing we're going to talk about is gear. So as the weeks get closer and closer to your trip, you kind of want to have a good understanding of what you're going to bring. Now, if this is your first time backpacking and you don't want to spend a whole lot of money on backpacking gear, you can definitely borrow from a friend. I would highly suggest that. That's best deal. Or using a gear rental service. You can buy cheaper gear on places like Amazon, but there's certain things that you don't necessarily have to get a camp version of. For instance, silverware. You have a spoon downstairs in your kitchen that you could definitely use. If you also have a friend that has, like, for instance, a stove or a tent, you can definitely split the gear. It's less weight for them or you to carry, and you also don't have to spend money on renting or buying said piece of gear. The last thing that you're going to do is you're going to take all of that information and knowledge that you learned about the trip and put it into one document. This is really good for planning purposes so that you know everything that's going on. It's also really good to give to another person that's coming with you on the trail. Plus, you also want to give this information to someone who is not going on the trip. This is for safety precautions. If something happens on the trail, Lord forbid, then these people can notify the emergency services if you do not come back on time, so that they know where you're at and how long you've been out and about. Other than that, it's time to pack up and head out to the trail. If you do need assistance with this template, I have a template of my own down in the description. This is something that I use for all of my planning when it comes to outdoor trips, whether that be backpacking, kayaking, whatever you can think of. If you guys liked this video, feel free to hit the like button, maybe subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.